Hi APE students, welcome to AP Environmental Science video number 6. It is on ecosystem ecology. Now, we need to understand the levels of organization within an ecosystem. So your first level is in the organism, one alligator. Then you have a population of alligator. Then you have a community, which now includes a bunch of different organisms. The ecosystem now includes the abiotic, which are all the non-living things in the ecosystem, so the water, the air, those sorts of things. And then the biome is the large region of the same kind of climate and animal plant features. Now we have one more level that is higher than the biome, and that is the biosphere, and that includes all of the Earth itself. Now, some limiting factors of populations, we have our carrying capacity. This is the greatest number of individuals a population can sustain. So when you go over here, we see we have this slow growth, then we hit exponential growth, also known as the J-shaped curve. And then once we hit our carrying capacity, we have hit this kind of S shape, which is called logistic growth. So your carrying capacity is maybe we ran out of enough water for everyone, so now our population has leveled off. Now, what stage is the human population in? We are still in this J-shaped curve, the growing exponentially. We really don't know what the carrying capacity of the human population could be. So some types of limiting factors, what can limit your population and make it hit carrying capacity. There are some density dependent factors, things that depend on your population size, like food, water, and shelter, disease, that sort of thing. If there's not very many individuals, disease can't spread very far. Density independent factors are temperature, drought, floods, pollution. These are things that the population size does not matter. It's still going to be affected the same way. So if you have 100 organisms versus one organism, a drought is going to have the same impact on those organisms. So looking at these different factors, we have already used these terms a little bit, but just make sure you understand them, get your definitions. So ecosystems consist of abiotic, which are your non-living factors, things like the sun, the wind, the temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen. And then there's also living factors, which are your biotic components, the plants, the animals, bacteria, all those sorts of things. So some different organisms and their specific roles kind of in an environment. So you have your keystone species. This is an organism that has an unusually large effect on the ecosystem. Things like wolves, alligators, elephants. You should be able to give some examples. Beavers are also keystone species. So the way I like to think about this is think about it as an arc, and your keystone species is kind of that middle piece of the arc. And if you take that apart or you take that off, the entire arc is going to collapse. So that is kind of how your keystone species impacts the ecosystem. Indicator species serve as warnings to damage, like pollution and things like that. They tend to be insects, amphibians. When looking at water quality, we look at little macroinvertebrates, things like the water penny, the leech, organisms like that. Think the canary in the coal mine. So when people used to go mining for coal, they would bring a canary in there, and if the bird died, then you knew that something was going on and the people should get out as well. So that's kind of what's happening with indicator species. They tell us that something is wrong in an ecosystem. So looking at the different roles that species play in their environment, this is called a niche or a niche. And then niche partitioning is the process by which competing species use the environment a little bit differently so that they can coexist. And kind of your classic example is the warblers. So these are all different kinds of birds down here. There's actually 5 different species of warbler, and each one of them uses a different part of the tree so that they're not interfering with the other's ability to survive. One may use the bottom, one may feed at the middle, one may feed at the top. So this would be an example of niche partitioning. When we look at our producers and our consumers in an ecosystem, we need to understand a little bit of the chemistry behind it. So producers, how are they actually providing energy in our ecosystem? Where they're doing this by photosynthesis. This is a very important equation, so please make sure you get it and you write it down. You do need to know the equation for photosynthesis, memorize it. One way that you can remember it, not necessarily the best example, but it is kind of good. If you can remember these numbers, 666, like I said, not exactly the best thing, but people can remember that. It is 6 CO2, 6 H2O, glucose, and then 6O2. So that is what plants are producing. And then we are taking in that glucose and oxygen, and we're giving off the carbon dioxide in the water, which is then going to be taken in by the plant, and the process can continue. So this is kind of the cycle of life that we can get energy from. So here is an example of a food chain. It's very basic. I kind of expect that you already know this sort of stuff. So we're going to kind of go pretty fast through these things. So you can rewind the video if you need to and go back to it. But your producers are the base of your food chain. Then maybe the grasshopper, that's their primary consumer, is eating the producer. The secondary consumer eats the primary consumer. Tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer, and then you have things like apex predators. They're going to be the top of the food chain, are going to eat those tertiary consumers. You don't normally go past this because we're going to talk about how energy flows in just a little while, and you'll see there's not a lot of energy up here to be had. The other thing is you have decomposers like mushrooms, earthworms, bacteria down here, which are decomposing and taking energy from all of these organisms. So really there should be arrows going from the grasshopper, the bird, and the snake as well. And that's putting the nutrients back into the soil. So a couple of terms you should be aware of. Autotroph is the same thing as a producer. Auto means self, so you are self-making your own food. A heterotroph is someone who cannot make their own food, so they are relying on the autotrophs to get that food. Then we have a couple of terms. We have herbivore. Those are things that only eat plants. We have carnivore, things that only eat animals. And we have an omnivore, things that eat both. And again, food chains, it's this linear relationship that we see going on. Now, the difference between a food chain and a food web here, you see it is not that linear relationship. It is more pyramidal. So you could draw a pyramid and actually have a food web pyramid. You've got multiple producers, you have multiple primary consumers, multiple secondary and tertiary consumers. So as soon as you start adding in more than one individual of any of those trophic levels, you get a food web. And again, you have your producers, make sure you know that term, and you have your consumers. So here is our pyramid. If we took that food web and made it into a pyramid, this is what it would look like. This is normally what we're going to see in the ecological pyramids. Your base always has 100% of the energy. That's your producers. You cannot have a food web without having a producer. And then this 10% rule that we see here, please make sure you make a note of that. This is called the 10% rule. 10% of energy passes on to each level. So say, for example, we have 20,000 kilocalories within our producers. Well, 10% is going to move to our primary consumers. 10% of 20,000 is 2,000 kilocalories. Then 10% of your primary moves to secondary. So 10% of 2,000 is 200, and going all the way up to where we would only have 2 kilocalories in our quaternary consumers. So this is the reason why you're not going to have another step up. There's just not enough energy to be had to support another level of the food chain. Why are we losing all that energy? Well, we'll talk about what law of thermodynamics that is, but we're losing it in the form of heat, waste, and all that kind of stuff are going out. So our second law of thermodynamics says no reaction is 100% efficient. You lose energy. That is the law that tells us that we only get 10% moving through each food web or each trophic level. Now, it's not always 10%. It could be 20, it could be 5, but on average, it's going to be 10%. So a couple of other things, we have a pyramid of numbers, shows the number of organisms at each trophic level in an ecosystem. So we have 2,000 plants, we have 25 voles, and then we have 1 owl. Notice it gets smaller as we move up. That's usually how a pyramid works. However, sometimes pyramids of numbers don't work out too well. So for example, if you're talking about something like a tree, well, a tree is very large, it has a lot of leaves, but we only say it's one tree. So you have one tree supporting a lot of caterpillars, a lot of birds, and whatever this is up here, cat or fox or something. So this is not a pyramid. You want to have your pyramid shaped like a triangle, and the bottom down here is kind of weird. So we don't really like pyramid of numbers that much, even though you probably will see it sometimes. Instead of pyramid of numbers, we use biomass pyramids. So biomass is the amount of dry organic matter present in an organism. So literally, if you took all of the water out of us, there wouldn't be a whole lot left, but all of that stuff that's left, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, carbon, all of that stuff, that's our dry organic biomass. So it's the total mass this time, not size. So now we have the tree down here that has a large mass, and then all the other mass of organisms get smaller, and we do see that actual pyramidal shape. So if we go back to that same pyramid, here's the biomass pyramid instead of the pyramid of numbers. And it works out again because now we have that nice pyramidal shape. So last thing we're going to talk about are biomagnification and bioaccumulation in an ecosystem and in a food chain. So bioaccumulation is when one single organism accumulates toxins. So say I ate something that had toxins in it. We're going to talk about different organisms that do, certain types of fish. You may have heard about mercury poisoning before, but mercury in fish is going to be consumed by me, and I start to accumulate multiple toxins as I'm eating more and more of those fish. Bioaccumulation is when contaminants start to increase at each step of the food web. So this is no longer just one individual, this is an entire food web or food chain. So down here you'll notice that the plants don't have a lot of toxins, 0.04 ppm, that stands for parts per million. So please make sure you get that, parts per million. So now the fish that eats the plants is going to have 0.23 because it's eating a lot of plants that has the pollution in it. So this small fish has 0.23. The big fish is eating the smaller fish. So now the big fish has 2.07. And then the big bird is eating many of these larger fish that have 2. Sorry, that's my dog sneezing. Apologize for that. And the bird is going to have 13.8 parts per million. So you'll notice as we get up in the food chain, we have less and less organisms, but those organisms have higher amounts of pollution inside of them. So I'm going to play a little game for you. If you're not aware of Pac-Man, you should play Pac-Man. I'll tell you why we're playing Pac-Man in just a second. Okay, so I'm the little yellow thing down at the bottom. And I'm trying not to get eaten by the ghosts. You may be wondering why in the world this is happening. I don't think I've ever actually won this game each time I play it. Not doing too bad. Oh no. Oh! Somehow Alright, so anyway. Now, let's go back to what we were talking about, and I'll tell you why we were playing Pac-Man. So imagine that Pac-Man is a consumer, and the consumer is eating food, plants or animals, and the pellets are going to represent pollution. So here's our Pac-Man eating pellets. Okay, so the blue dots are now going to be our pollution that Pac-Man ate. And then we have a ghost that's going to eat Pac-Man, and it's going to end up getting all of the pollution. So the ghost eats Pac-Man, and now it has all the pollution that Pac-Man had. Now the ghost is going to eat another Pac-Man, and it's also going to get all of that pollution. So here the ghost comes, and it eats Pac-Man again. So now you'll notice that the amount of pollution has doubled in that one ghost. And it can eat another Pac-Man, and you see how this can continue on. Okay, so the pollution is going to biomagnify through the food chain. Now this fish is going to come and eat the ghost, and it's going to get all of the pollution inside that fish. So when it's going to eat another fish or another ghost, you'll notice that it gets even higher. So here's what that looks like in our food chain. We notice, again, parts per million down here, and we're getting higher and higher as we go through the food chain. Now, if we talk about fish, you probably eat fish, salmon, tuna, these kinds of things. If you consume them, the FDA actually sets limits for these kinds of things, especially for pregnant women and children, because it can get and bioaccumulate inside of you, and then it can get into the fetus and cause problems to the baby, and actually be toxic and can cause mercury poisoning, which we'll talk about what the effects of that are. All right, that's all I have for you today. I'll bring your questions tomorrow.